morning, everyone. Just to revisit these forms to fill out the evaluation forms, I do have a parting gift on your way out when everyone's making their way out. Once you hand us back the evaluation forms, we do have a shirt for you, so kind of ensure that we get things taken care of there at the end. So just to look at what we're going to cover today, introduce myself, and we're going to be discussing a wiring installation from start to finish, from the planning, the performing, the wrapping up of the installation. Then we'll be touching a little bit on fuel injection electronics, some new products, and I'm sure we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. But I want to be sure to let everyone know, I'm up here on the podium, but please do not hesitate to stop me and ask a question. I'm very good at picking up where I left off, so I would like this to be interactive and give you all the chance to ask the questions through the what I'm going to cover here. So just to give a little background of not only Ron Francis but myself, I started working for Ron back in 1992. I spent about 10 years working for him, and I've worked in many different facets of the company. Back in about 2002, we had parted ways. I started up my own business, ended up buying part of his product line, namely the fuel injection, and the new company that I had created was the Detail Zone, and I took that fuel injection product line and grew it quite a bit, and still worked hand in hand with Ron Francis Wiring on a lot of projects and ideas. Then about 2007, Ron approached me and said, okay, I've pretty much had enough. You can buy out the rest of my company now. So it took a couple years after that to combine the companies back together. And we're all under one roof again, one company. And we have a product line now of about 700 to 800 different part numbers in our catalog. So I have quite a bit of experience. I have a very, very good crew behind me back at the company that also supports everything that's in the catalog and everything in between. So to start, we're looking at what we need to consider when planning a wiring system install. Sir, can we turn that down just a little bit? I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. So one of the primary considerations would be whether you want to consider a front-loading or a pre-wired fuse panel. And what I mean by that is you have either the wires attached to the fuse panel and you're running the wires out to your equipment, or you're doing the opposite. You're plugging wires into your equipment and running them back to the fuse panel and making your terminations there. These are just a couple examples of what Ron Francis Wiring offers in both of those types of setups. A lot of this has to do with personal preference, what you're used to, what you're more comfortable doing. Both of these systems can create a very good installation. Next would be the number of circuits. Gentlemen, if you didn't get a folder on your way in, if you could get one on the way out, or over here on the table. So the number of circuits, or fuses, is pretty straightforward as long as you are clear in what your projections and expectations are of the vehicle that you're wiring. Example of one of our 8 fuse panels on the left, and then we have a 16 fuse panel on the right. And circuits to consider could be anything from typical circuits in any vehicle, from the wiper, radio, horn, lights, to accessories such as fans, fuel pump, power windows, door locks, air suspension, any other equipment that you might have in the car. And just to touch on those circuits a little bit more, it's always good if you're doing an installation for someone else or you are a shop and wiring up a customer's car, you want to read what that customer typically does. If they tend to add things at the last minute. If they typically throw more ideas at you right in the middle of the build, you really need to think ahead and consider, what's this customer going to want? And if it's the type of customer that does add things after the fact, for just a little bit more expense, you can typically get into a much bigger fuse panel that's going to suit the customer's needs. That planning can have a very big effect on how you handle the wiring of the rest of the vehicle. So the third consideration is locking down the configuration. And where this comes in is, if we can know those three pieces of information, the alternator, the distributor, and the steering column, we can build a kit that is going to help you have a very successful installation. When it comes to things like the alternator, we can cover alternators from a one-wire to a sixth-generation Ford alternator. After the fact, we can still handle it for you, but it's much better to know ahead of time, and it really saves time as far as getting the wiring kit installed and getting your customer on their way. Any questions? Typically, we can turn around a kit in a couple days. Sometimes, due to seasonal demand, it might be a little higher than that, but typically, all these different modular groups of wiring are ready to go, and that's one of the beauties with our system, our wiring kit, is we can put together your kit once we know what you have. It's sort of like grocery shopping. It really depends on what circuit you're speaking of. Something like a radio and maybe a transmitter or receiver might not be too bad to be on the same circuit. When it comes to high amperage, high duty cycle circuits, you certainly want them on separate circuits.
Could you, if we called with those questions, would you have people that could help us?
Yes, we do. The question was the sharing of circuits and how we feel shared circuits should be handled in terms of power windows and power door locks, things of that nature being shared on the same circuit or fuse. Yes, sir.
Lockdown configuration of the distributor steering column. When you do that, you look at the length of those circuits as well?
No, our wire lengths are predetermined. We give you more than you need, and you'll be trimming wires to length. With one exception, if you tell us that you have a very long vehicle and you potentially want to mount the panel somewhere other than forward of the front seat, we might get you into a long wire kit, which would ensure that you have wires long enough for your application. So there's that plan ahead again. Can't stress enough how important it is to plan what you're going to do with your project vehicle so that we can help you get involved in the right wiring kit that's going to get you on the road. There's a maybe poor example of planning ahead. My feeling is typically it's better to have your wires buttoned down more than less, as there's an inherent strain relief solution going on there. You don't want wires hanging and able to move around too much. So performing the installation, some of the fundamentals, the first being choose good wire paths. Shorter is always better, and there's many reasons for that, some of them being less resistance. Every wire inherently has resistance built into it, and that's touching on that heat aspect. Resistance builds heat. So typically, if you have a shorter wire, you'll incur less resistance in the wire. Secondly, less risk of damage. The more wire that's passing through cars in different areas, every place that wire goes, every piece of metal that it touches, is another chance of damage to that wire. So while it's important to choose good wire paths, if you typically plan on shorter wires, you can hope to experience a less risk of damage and that less resistance. And touching on that resistance issue again, the smaller wire can be used because, as I had mentioned, when a wire is shorter, you have less resistance because every wire does have resistance built into it. Next would be proper crimps and proper crimp tools. Very important. That's another source of potential resistance and other types of failure if the wires are not tight under the crimp. So this is a open barrel terminal that is commonly used in Chevy vehicles back from like the 50s up through the 70s. And there's some different examples there. As you can see, the top one, of those two crimps that you can see, the one on the left is the actual conductor or wire crimp, and the second one is intending to crimp on the insulation. So that's showing you a bad crimp because the insulation is not under the insulation crimp. The next one down showing you that the wire has been pushed in a little too far, and you're actually starting to crimp on some of the insulation, which can compromise the conductivity of the wire. And then the third one down, obviously there's strands that aren't under the crimp, so the wire is not able to carry the full potential. And then at the bottom we have a good crimp. So the question is, the gentleman was asking about the contact surface of the terminal. In fact, the mate of that particular terminal is intending to slide in from the left into the contact face, and it's intending to have a contact patch there pretty much bordering that whole enclosure. You certainly, it's important to always match the proper terminals to the circuit that you're using and not exceed the amperage rating of that particular terminal or connector series. And may I just add, this is one example. This slide is in our catalog. We have multiple pages of tech and troubleshooting in the back of our catalog, and this happens to be one of those slides, but I just want to let everyone know when you have a chance you might want to take a look. I'll be referencing a couple other examples, but these are straight out of our catalog. Next, as far as terminal integrity, we have pull testing. This is something that we perform in our production operations just to make sure that we have proper termination on the wires. Now, we don't expect every installer to be doing a pound rating pull test on every crimp they make, but this is just an example of the kinds of pressures you should be expecting on different terminals as far as our resistance from pulling off. As a builder, you would typically just want to give terminals a good pull every now and then to make sure that you have indeed placed a good crimp on the terminal. Next fundamental will be grounds and battery cables. Grounds are very, very important. And if you think about it in terms of a circuit path, it's 50% of the circuit. But yet many people overlook their importance. So when you're dealing with old cars that are rusty, or even new builds that are fully painted, powder coated, all of those things can highly compromise a good ground. So it's important to plan. Running grounds are much easier to perform when you're installing the wiring kit than after the fact when the car is finished and you're having trouble with different components. With lights, you get some funky things going on with lights, or different electronics are not operating properly. Much better to plan ahead and expect to ground well when you're installing the complete kit. The question was dielectric grease versus Vaseline. Personally, I've never used Vaseline. I don't think that that's going to be all that bad, but I would typically use, for the cost, dielectric grease might end up staying on that area longer than Vaseline would. If you've ever gotten dielectric grease on your fingers, it's very synthetic and it's very hard to get off. Next would be battery cables. Obviously, as the battery is providing a lot of power to the vehicle, good battery cables are necessary to complete those circuits. And one aspect that many people do not consider when they're trying to use a frame for grounding the battery, a steel frame is not a good solution. As you can see, it only conducts a percentage of what copper can. For that reason, we always recommend that the battery be grounded right to the engine, and then the engine be grounded to the body and the frame. Certainly not a fan of aluminum. Question being Corvettes and the fact that they were grounded, had batteries in the back grounded to the frame, and what was the other part? Use of aluminum wire versus copper. I don't think aluminum wire has any place in a vehicle, especially with as brittle as it is. I think copper is the proper conductor to use in a vehicle. I think if there was anything to gain with aluminum, the OEMs were using it. Yeah, I've seen many wires and battery cables that the insulation looks totally fine, and you open it up and it's green inside, and it's nearly destroyed. So. And you just brought up a good point. The gentleman commented on the flexibility of the particular battery cable you're dealing with. I've been asked many times about welding cable. While I don't dislike welding cable, I don't feel that it has the proper wire covering. Is a typical automotive grade battery cable that has like an SAE grade. Battery cables for automobiles typically are like SGX covering or SXL. That is much stiffer than what welding cable jacketing is. And not only will you be trying to support that welding cable a lot further in the vehicle, creating more work for an install, but the jacketing is not necessarily heat or oil resistant like that of an automotive grade battery cable. Next would be form versus function. And this is something that we see almost on a daily basis, and we feel it's very important to continue to discuss and make aware. Certainly, we all know building street rods and hot rods, form versus function is always present. What looks good and what performs well. So it's something to always consider. If you're going to compromise in certain areas due to this form versus function, you need to make good decisions on what prevails, what direction you go in when you're faced with form versus function. The question was, as far as grounding goes, grouped grounds or individual grounds. It really depends on the install. I would say typically at a corner of a car, if you can find a good ground for the light socket, even if they are separate light sockets for, let's say, turn signal, possibly brake, and running lights, a single good grounding location on that corner would probably suit the install well. If it comes to having to ground all the front lights together or all the rear lights together, I would say typically I would choose that second versus being able to ground the corners individually. And thinking about some of the fundamentals that I've focused on, hopefully that kind of explains my reasoning there. Okay, moving on. We have wrapping the installation up. So one of the adages with construction is measure twice, cut once. Same here. You cut wires short, you're either going to start compromising what you wanted to do, or you may end up having to make splices or connections you wouldn't have wanted to make. Buttoning down the wires, we touched on that a little bit as far as strain reliefs and bundling. And clean covering solutions to protect the wires. There's multiple solutions out on the marketplace, from zip loom to braids, proper wrap tape. Any questions? Sure. The question was quick discussion about different wrap tapes for electrical harnesses. A typical wrap tape is almost like a thick saran wrap, where there is no adhesive. It tends to stick to itself, and the trick there is that it does not leave any adhesive on the wires as a typical electrical tape with adhesive does. Once electrical tape with adhesive sticks on the wire for a while and there might be a few heat cycles, it definitely wants to leave a residue, and it's no fun to deal with. So, does that answer your question? I mean, the typical wrap tape comes in different widths. I think the version that we offer is about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. It has a certain stretch to it, so you can put it on with a certain amount of tension, and the tighter you pull it, the nicer job it typically makes.
So you have better options than off-the-shelf friction tape.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes, thank you. I meant to pass around a example. Crimp tools are very important. We do carry several versions in our catalog. I can go ahead and pass this one around. Most terminals offered in our wiring kits are able to be crimped with off-the-shelf crimp tools. Occasionally, if you do a lot of wiring installations, you might want to get into something that is a bit more specific to something such as the open barrel terminal I showed on the screen, where we had an anatomy of a crimp. Can you pass that around, please? Did that answer your question about crimp tools? Moving on to fuel injection. We offer many different solutions, wiring kits, for everything from TPI up to LS1s, from early Ford 5.0s up to 4.6 and 5.4s. I'd just like to touch on a few items. It's very important to know what you have. If a customer brings you a car with an engine and you do not know the year, make, and model of the engine, or the customer tells you, but it's all in a box, it's a box of parts, hard to identify. It's important to get a hold of some of the part numbers on it and maybe call someone in the industry or your local dealer, someone who will lend an ear, and discuss those parts. A lot of times we find where customers put parts together and don't know what they have. Maybe some of the parts look the same or they assume that they were good, and they end up chasing problems, and it can turn into a lot of heartache. And you see there we talk about planning ahead. It's good to know what your customer's expectations are. Something like a Ford 5.0, if it's a non-mass airflow engine, they do not tend to like any kind of modifications to the motor. Chevy TPI engines were never real good at high horsepower. So if your customer is expecting 600 horsepower out of a TPI topped engine, you might want to try to sit down with them and renegotiate his expectations. And again, have a plan that you can confirm. We have a lot of customers that come to us and want us to do the wiring harness, the computer reprogramming, and pretty much have us on the hook for everything. And sometimes that's because they've heard horror stories or they've been involved in horror stories themselves, but they want some accountability. If they come to us and they want a complete solution, then they have someone to look at and come to if they have a problem. If they get the computer from one company and the harness from another and some of the sensors of the engine from a third, and they have problems, it can cause complications as far as accountability on how to get that installation running. Any questions? Okay. The question is what kind of terminals we provide in our wiring kits for different equipment. It really depends on what circuit we're speaking of. Some of them could be solderless or typical insulated terminals, whether they're rings or forks, different sizes like the reds for like 18 gauge and the blues for 14, 16 and the yellows for 12 and under. Or they could be some of the more open barrel terminals that you saw on the screen there. We were talking about the anatomy of a crimp. So it really depends on what circuits we're speaking of. Here's a couple of our fuel injection wiring solutions. On the left, we have our panel style, which allows you to mount the panel and the computer wherever you like in the project vehicle. And then we give you 20 feet of wire on each sensor connector so that you can plug the sensor in and run the wires back to that panel. Every wire is printed every 10 inches where it's coming from and going to. Makes for a clean installation if it's a street rod or hot rod and you want the firewall smoothed off and you don't want to see many wires. On the right would be a pre-made wrapped harness. That example is for putting a Ford 5.0 into, say, an early Mustang or Bronco. The question is, can we offer custom ECMs with programming? We do. We're somewhat limited on what ECMs we do reprogram. When it comes to GM, we can do all LS1 based computer reprogramming. And for Fords, we can do the anything from about 87 on up. We typically do not supply computers or ECMs. Typically, the customer supplies it, it gets reprogrammed, and that customer gets his ECM back. If he doesn't have an ECM, we can source one for them. Excellent, good question. The question was what kind of insulation we use on our wires. And the customer has heard some reports on soy-based wire insulations and the potentiality of rodent damage. We have touched on this here in the past couple of years. We have a dealer out on the West Coast who got this kind of problem repeatedly in the same new vehicle. And we use GXL and TXL wire coatings on all of our wires. That's a cross-link wire coating. It's a SAE spec. And I'm happy to tell you that they're all soybean-based soybean free. We had contacted all of our manufacturers, all of our wire manufacturers, and confirmed that no soy-based materials are used in their production. That's not to say that a customer is not going to have that kind of problem. I just don't think it's going to be as prevalent as some of the OEMs. There's a couple manufacturers out there who shall remain anonymous who do use a lot of soybean-based products on their wire coverings.
Is there any kind of spray or something you could spray on like a factory existing harness to prevent some of that?
Not that I have heard. And this one dealer of ours, they had taken precautions the second time, and I guess the habit had already formed. And I don't remember if it was cayenne pepper or some other kind of rodent be gone, but it didn't work. And they went right back at it. Moving on to new products. One of the new products we've come out with recently are a line of switch panels. And they work in conjunction with our Express and Bare Bones wiring kit products. We offer them in 3 versions. A plain one that has self-adhesive labels to attach. A version that's Pro Street that has a turn signal switch capability, and a Pro Race that basically has lights but no turn signals. We're also offering that back cover for different means of mounting. The Bare Bones is a 8-circuit fuse panel. The Express is a 16-circuit fuse panel. So for either one of those items, if you're getting into a more race-inspired install and you don't have a traditional ignition switch, dimmer switch, headlight switch, wiper, heater switch, one of these switch panels can take the place of those switches. Some other recent products we've come out with were some connectors that weren't available elsewhere. We consider them problem solvers. The one on the left is a molded connector for AOD transmissions, Ford AOD. That particular switch handles neutral safety and backup light functions. The one on the right is a 2-wire molded connector for Ford 5-speed T5 transmissions for the backup lights. And before we, if I'd only known. That they're readily available, they've proven to be very popular, mainly because their only other source would be salvage yards or donor vehicles. That enclosure, yeah, that can be mounted to a roll bar or some kind of flat panel. Next new line of products is some Fox body replacement harnesses. That one you see there is a front lighting harness for a 91 through 93 Mustang Fox body. That's just to add to many that we've already offered for the Fox body, from transmission harnesses to fuel tank harness, injector harness, and we're slowly trying to connect the dots on what we offer for these vehicles. So now we're down to question and answer. In case you guys been saving anything for me.
What's your opinion on weather connectors?
The question was, what's my opinion of weather pack connectors? They are a very versatile connector system that GM used back in the late 80s, early 90s. Personally, I like it. They're much easier to crimp for a do-it-yourselfer than some of the later stuff. And I think capacity on those connector systems are about 20 amps, which typically means it could probably handle quite a bit of a typical circuit in a project vehicle. So, yeah, my personal opinion is I like them. I use them in my own vehicles. Yes. Yeah, they do come apart easy, and they're available in a lot of different configurations. I think we have them in our catalog for like 1 to 6 circuits.
It's on.
It's on.
It's working.
It's working.
If you want it off for a minute, I can turn it off.
Yeah.
we're not alone. Any other questions? Okay, I guess it's a wrap. I appreciate everyone coming, braving the cold and early morning here. And if you can step over here with me and get your evaluation forms. I got some shirts. I hope we don't run out. Anyone who had answered our email, I certainly tried to bring enough different sizes with me. So if you just bear with me, I'm here alone, but I'll be happy to assist passing these out. Thank you.